Hello, I'm Jeff Paur, Senior Writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. Welcome to another edition of the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. On today's show, I'm joined by my son, Henry Paur. Henry, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, no problem.
Henry and I, we're going to do this every week. We did it last week. We're going to do a weekly preview, fantasy preview. We're doing week 2 this week, obviously, because week 1 took place last week. So, Henry, thoughts on week 1 before we get into week 2? Anything stand out to you? Any performances? Anything at all?
I mean, it seems like there was a lot of receivers and then coming to play football this week. Like Marvin Harrison, that was a pretty big shocker, I think, in the fantasy football community with that first week.
The tight end position as well was a stinker. It was awful. I think there was 4 or 5 double-digit scorers, and 2 of them were people who weren't even started for most people. But it'll rebound. I tell everybody, don't fret. It's a long season. We looked at some of this stuff as well, like Dalton Kincaid. He was getting triple teamed. They were taking him away in that game. Arizona was doing everything they can. Maybe it's a trend with him because their receivers aren't very good. Maybe they're going to make teams beat them other ways. But I think it'll get better for Kincaid, for Mark Andrews as well. He had to block a lot in that game as opposed to run routes like Likely, because Likely doesn't block as well because their offensive line's not very good. So I think it'll get better for these guys. I'm not too worried.
Yeah, another thing about Mark Andrews, he actually was the second tight end in routes run this week. He ran more than Isaiah Likely, and that makes a statement. He ran routes. They just did a great job of covering him. They double team and then triple team them just like they did with Kincaid. They take away that big number 1 weapon they use.
Exactly. So let's move on to week 2 now. We could talk about some matchups quickly. So we're going to give you each a hot play at quarterback, running back, receiver, and tight end. Then we're going to give you 3 fades, players we don't really like too much, and then 2 sleepers, maybe some people flying under the radar that could do well. But before we get to that, any matchups in particular you're looking forward to?
I'm looking forward to mostly to the game we have tomorrow night as we have Miami and Buffalo. I think this is the game of the week right here. It's kicking off Amazon Prime's season for Thursday Night Football. I think we get to see a great matchup here. A little kind of skeptical. I want to know what happens to the running back position if there's no A-Chain tomorrow night. Will we finally see
Jalen Wright?
Jalen Wright.
Jeff Wilson.
It only took A-Chain 1 game to become a big point in that offense. I'm also looking forward to the Green Bay game. I'd like to see how Malik Willis looks in this offense and see what Green Bay can do without Jordan Love for the first time in a year.
I think the Giants-Washington's the game of the week.
Really?
No, I don't. You're right, though. I think the matchup on Thursday night's a really good one, Buffalo-Miami. I'm also kind of intrigued by the Monday night game as well with Atlanta and Philadelphia. See if Atlanta can rebound in that matchup. See if Kirk Cousins looks any better. Didn't look very good in week 1. That's a concern. Aaron Rodgers, too. I kind of want to see how he looks. Don't know if I particularly like that game, New York, Tennessee. It shouldn't be very exciting, but I want to see how he looks. I just didn't think he was moving around very well.
Yeah, and also he's facing a really good defense again this week.
Yep.
Tennessee looked phenomenal last week, at least on defense, maybe not so much on offense, but defensively they look great. Their D-line looked phenomenal. DBs looked great. They had L'Jarius Sneed, obviously, and some free agency acquisitions with Chidobe Awuzie, and their defense looked great. I'd like to see what Rodgers against it. I feel like we have to mention Kansas City and Cincinnati also this week, but
it's always been a great matchup.
It's always a thing that's kind of with Cincinnati the last 2 years with them really starting slow in the first couple of weeks. So I don't know how this one's going to shake out with. They just lost to New England last week, and now they're going to. I think they're in Kansas City this week.
It's in Kansas City, correct?
Yeah. So now you're going to Arrowhead to face Mahomes, who just had a big primetime win against Baltimore. So
yeah, good luck with that. All right, let's get into these hot plays now. Players we like for this week. We'll start with the quarterback position. Henry, who's your quarterback you really like?
I had the guy, I got his jersey on, Justin Herbert. I know last week was a little bit of a stinker. I think he only had 1 touchdown thrown to Ladd McConkey, but now they face Carolina. Carolina just allowed 47 points to the Saints. Now, I do think Harbaugh is going to put a big emphasis on the run game this week, so that's his thing. He did that a lot at Michigan. But with how many points the Saints scored last week, I think that he's going to get some passing touchdowns thrown too. And this defense got a lot worse for Carolina. They lost Derek Brown for the season, so they lost their best player on defense for the season, and then interior D-line. So they are going to run the ball, but Herbert still, I think, had like 14, 15 points last week, and that's only 1 touchdown. If he had a bunch more yards than that, maybe 1 more touchdown, that's about a 20-point game. And that's what you want out of your quarterback position.
Exactly. Panthers already looking like a team to target from fantasy perspective. So I like Baker Mayfield a lot this week. I know he had a great week last week, 4 touchdowns, 289 yards. I think we may have undervalued him, but I think he's a real deal. Had a breakout season last year. Now he gets Detroit. I think it'll be a high-scoring game. Detroit allowed 304 passing yards last week. I know they tried to improve that secondary, but still looks to be an issue. I think this is going to be a shootout. I love Mayfield this week. I think he'll keep it going. All right, Henry, who's your running back for the hot play?
I have Brian Robinson of Washington. I know that Eckler did take a decent amount of that passing game work, but Robinson was the clear goal line back, it looked like. I know Jane Daniels may steal a couple of those touchdowns, but he was tackled at the 1 yard line twice last week and only rushed in 1 touchdown. If he can get maybe 1 or 2 more, he had a great week. And he still had 18 points last week. He had a great week. Giants we know how they operate. Their D-line's pretty solid, but they weren't the very best against their run last week, and I could see them running all over them again this week. And Robinson had a great week last week. Again, he only had 40 rushing yards, and he still put up 18 points. He was still involved in the passing game, which we were worried about. And I think it's going to be great. Jane Daniels seems to still like to dump the ball off even if he can't run it.
I love James Conner this week of the Arizona Cardinals. He was a huge focal point of that offense last week. He had 19 total touches in the game. He played 67% of the snaps. Rookie Trey Benson was not a factor. Some people thought he was going to put a dent in his workload. That was not the case. I think they're going to lean on him again this week against the Los Angeles Rams. Aaron Donald's not there anymore to anchor that line. Rams allowed the 3rd most fantasy points of running backs in week 1. I think Conner has another huge game this week. Let's talk about the receiver position now. Who do you like there?
I have another guy. I'm going back to your game of the week here in Giants, Washington. I have Malik Neighbors. I know last week was 5 catches, I think, for around 66 yards, which is pretty solid for Rookie's first game. And now he faces a team that just got torched through the air last week by Godwin and by Mike Evans. I know that's a better offense probably than the Giants, but he's the main receiver in this offense, the main weapon in this offense. They seem to make it emphasis in the second half to get him the ball after a very quiet first half. So I think he's going to have a big week here. I think this is his breakout week to show the world that he was drafted top 10 for a reason this year.
Exactly. I think he has a lot of potential for sure. I like Drake London this week. He disappointed everybody last week. The whole Falcons offense did, quite frankly, out of Bijan. Kyle Pitts scored a touchdown, but quite frankly, the offense was just not very good. But I think London rebounds in a big way. They're going to make it a point to get him the ball early and often. He is the number 1 receiver in an offense. Could be playing from behind here in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is also not very good against the pass. I think this bodes well for London. I think he has a big rebound game this week. Don't fret over last week. I think he gets it going. All right, Henry, let's talk about a tight end before we move on to fades. Who do you like?
I have a guy that you talked about earlier. They're triple teaming them, and I think this week is finally his week. He's going to show why the offensive coordinator mentioned that they need to get him more involved. That was hard to do that last week, but this week they plan to do that, and that is Dalton Kincaid. I think this game tomorrow night is going to be very high scoring. 2 high-powered offense going back and forth. The Bills' defense didn't look the best lately, and I thought Miami was a little skeptical at points last week, especially in that first half against Jacksonville, and Jacksonville's offense is just, kind of okay. And now you're facing the Bills, who looked very good last week. We all worried about no Stephon Diggs, but they look great. Run-heavy game. And I think this week's a week where they air it out, and they should. Josh Allen could throw the ball without Stephon Diggs in that offense.
I hope so, because I have a ton of Kincaid this year, thinking he's going to have a breakout season. So hopefully he gets it going, and your pick is correct. I'm going to go with Juwan Johnson of the Saints. A little deeper dive here, but it was a little surprising. Foster Moreau actually out-snapped Johnson last week, 77 to 35%, which was a big surprise. But Moreau's in the concussion protocol, probably not going to play. I think this bodes well for Johnson to find the field. Even though he didn't play a lot last week, Johnson still scored a touchdown. Plays the Cowboys. I think they're playing from behind in this matchup. Cowboys also allowed the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends in week 1. I like Johnson as a play here this week at a tight end position that just wasn't, quite frankly, very good in week 1. All right, Henry, talk about the opposite ends of things. Fades. So we're just going to give you 3 players that we're not too high on this week. I'll let you start. Who's your first fade?
I have Christian Watson. I know that there's no Jordan Love, and I don't know how this Malik Willis train is going to pan out here. I think he may check the ball down a lot more this game. I think they're going to run the ball a lot too. I don't know how much Watson's going to be involved. They had a bunch of red zone targets, but that's with a whole different QB, and I think this offense is going to change drastically because Willis has a way different play style than what Love has. He's more that scramble guy that's going to make plays on the run and do a lot of scrambling. So I worry about Watson, especially against this Colts defense. I think the Colts are a very good team, and I think their defense is very solid, and I think they're going to shut Watson down and scream the offense down.
I think the big difference between Willis and Jordan Love is that Willis is terrible.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's the big difference. All right, my fade is Tank Dell. So I like Dell. I think he's going to be a boomer bust play this year, but of the big three receivers of the Texans last week, he played the least. He played just 63% of the snaps. I mean, even Dalton Schultz is on the field more, Joe Mixon. So Dell's going to be hit or miss, and I think he's going to have a hard time reaching double-digit fantasy points this week against the Bears. They have a really good defense, especially against the pass. They allowed the fourth fewest fantasy points to receivers last week, and they were good last year in that area as well. So I think Dell, this could be one of the weeks you stay away from him. All right, Henry, who's another fade for you?
I'll stay with that game we just talked about, and I'll go with DeAndre Swift. Last week, the Texans shut down the run against Jonathan Taylor. I think he had under 50 rushing yards. And for an elite back like Taylor, that's a very bad day. And then Swift had a terrible week last week, playing from behind against Tennessee most of the game. And I expect Chicago to be doing the same thing again this week, playing from behind. He's not going to get many carries. He may get a couple of checkdowns, but he did not look very good last week in a fantasy output. But I'd be worried about Swift a lot this week.
I don't like to hear that because I have a lot of shares of Swift now, so that's not a good thing for me. But I agree, it was a little concerning that game last week. I'll give you a running back as well I don't like. That's Ezekiel Elliott. I think he's going to be a touchdown-dependent player. He scored a touchdown last week, so he helped fantasy teams. But he ran for just 40 yards, pretty much split the work with Rico Dowdle. And since he's a touchdown-dependent play, I don't like him much against the Saints, who have a pretty good defense. I don't think they're as dominant as they were last week. They're not going to be like that all the time. But I think it's a pretty solid defense overall. And they did a great job of shutting down Chuba Hubbard last week. So I'm fading Elliott this week. I don't think he finds the end zone, so I would go with other options. All right, Henry, who's your last fade?
I have Javonte Williams. I know last week was a very poor output again last week. That Julian McLaughlin played more in the passing downs, and they said they faced a Pittsburgh defense that I know he looked good, he looked great. Bijan Robinson looked good, but they held him very under check in that run game. He did not have many yards. I mean, he was first in efficiency for juke moves and all that last week, so he looked great, but they couldn't run the ball. And I'd be worried about Javonte Williams. Just got shut down last week at Seattle in a game where they're playing mostly from behind again. I expect that to be happening again this week with Denver. Especially with Bo Nix on their center. I think he's got to get a little bit to get his feet wet before he starts to take off. So I'd be worried about Javonte Williams in this matchup.
I agree. I started to drink the Kool-Aid thinking it's going to rebound and get it going, but I'm not too keen on him after last week. My last fade is Aaron Rodgers. Great to see him back on the field. I just didn't think he looked healthy, though. He wasn't moving great. Threw for just 167 yards and a touchdown, and they ran the ball a ton. Breece Hall was the focal point of that offense. Rodgers attempted just 21 passes. So that really concerns me for his fantasy value, especially this week on the road against Tennessee. As you mentioned earlier, that secondary is much improved, pretty good against the pass last week. I think they're going to be good again this week. So Rodgers is a guy I would just stay away from for now until he gets it going. All right, Henry, let's talk about a couple sleepers under the radar plays. Who do you got there?
So I picked the first guy who took off on Sunday Night Football, and that's Tyler Johnson. He had one huge catch against Detroit and had a very solid game. They get around 12 points. And now Puka Nacua is out for a couple weeks, and they face Arizona this week, who was very poor against the pass last week against the Bills offense. And the Rams made a point to really air the ball out last week. They threw the ball a ton, and I see them doing this again against Arizona, who's also poor against the pass, poor defense overall in Arizona. They have to score to keep up with a lot of opponents, and I think Tyler Johnson's he's going to be the guy to pick up out of this Puka thing, and I'm going to go with him this week.
I'm intrigued by him as well. I also wonder about Demarcus Robinson, how they're going to use him, because he was the number 3, and he was probably kept in that role last week because so much changed. So I wonder if they'll give him more reps as a number 2. So it'll be interesting to see how they use him. But right now, I think Johnson's definitely the guy. All right, I'll give you a sleeper, and it's a little bit of a deep sleeper. It's Jatavion Sanders of the Carolina Panthers. Panthers were a disaster last week, but still, Sanders was on the field for 73% of the plays, out there a ton. I think that's a great sign for him. I think they're playing from behind against the Chargers, so I think that looks like there could be more chances to throw the ball. That means Sanders could be involved. They have to do something. Bryce Young had a tough time getting the ball to his receiver, so maybe Sanders gets more looks this week. I liked him in the preseason. I think he's really talented. He's their number 1 tight end right now because of all the injuries, and I think he could end up having a pretty good day in week 2. All right, Henry, who's your last sleeper for this week?
I have Mike Gesicki of the Bengals. Last week he had a touchdown called back, which would have actually been a very solid day for him. He would have had 14 to 15 points, and he barely lost that one. And he still had 5 points, which isn't the best in the world. But I think in this game, it's going to be a big game for him. I expect no T. Higgins again this week. And Kansas City just let Isaiah Likely go all over them last week and have a huge week. I think Mike Gesicki is another good week here. I think they make an emphasis to stop Jamar Chase is going to be their goal, and I think that's going to leave opportunities for Gesicki, for Burrow. He seemed like a decent connection last week. I think Gesicki's a great sleeper this week.
My last sleeper is a receiver, and it's a guy I usually am not too keen on, but I was encouraged by him last week. That's Jerry Jeudy of the Cleveland Browns. I thought it was an encouraging performance. I know he had just 25 yards, but he caught 3 passes, scored a touchdown, was targeted 8 times. He had double-digit fantasy points against a good Cowboys defense. Much better matchup this week against Jacksonville. Jacksonville allowed the 5th most fantasy points for receivers in week 1. I think Judy's a good streaming play in this matchup. Cleveland's got a lot to prove this week, in my opinion, after a terrible showing in week 1. They're going to come out and need to win this game to keep any momentum going for the rest of the season. All right, Henry, thanks so much for joining me on this week 2 edition of the Fantasy Preview. And good luck to all you and your games this week.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a great time.
Should be a great week of action here in week 2. And I wish everybody out there a ton of luck in all of their games as well. And I appreciate you watching this edition of the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports.